This PowerPoint now will look at the last of the historical events that have molded modern journalism, and we'll also look at the long-term effects of all four of the events on modern journalism. So the fourth event is the Watergate scandal. And the the suffix gate, this is the origin of the suffix gate that we find on any kind of scandal nowadays related to politics or anything. Media will immediately tack on the end of it the word gate, simply because the Watergate is kind of the epitome in American history right now, of modern American history, of political scandal that was part of the Nixon administration from 1968 till his resignation in 1974. Watergate, the name Watergate comes from a building. The Watergate in Washington, D.C., if you've ever flown into Washington, D.C. and landed at Reagan Airport, the Watergate is this distinctive looking building that you'll see as you land. It is a hotel, it's an apartment complex, and it's an office building. All of these buildings it's kind of a complex of buildings. It was also the place where the national headquarters of the Democratic Party presidential campaign was situated in 1972. This was where the Democratic Party would run the presidential campaign for around the country. And this is where the leadership of the Democratic Party positioned themselves with their headquarters. In the early hours of June 17th, 1972, a security guard was coming around the building doing his rounds, and he found on one of the doors that led into the parking facility, one of the doors at the latch had been taped open. He didn't make anything of it because he knew that cleaning crews would come in at night. They would tape the latch open so they had easy access, and then they would leave. And sometimes they would forget to take the tape off of the latch, and because he had found this before. So he pulled the tape off the latch, closed the door, and went off on his rounds. Well, where his suspicions were raised was when he came back about a half an hour later and found that the tape was back on. He immediately called Washington, D.C. police, and what they found was 5 men in the Democratic National Headquarters working on the phones and doing something in there that they shouldn't be. First off, they shouldn't have been in there because they had broken into the headquarters. So they were already in trouble for violating a felony right then. What happened was that these men were taken into custody and then put into jail. And the following morning, Saturday morning, they were brought before a judge to give a plea in their case for their arraignment. One of the reporters at the arraignment was a young reporter for the Washington Post. He heard one of the burglars mention that one of his professions was working for the CIA. This immediately roused the suspicion of the reporter, who eventually came back to his newsroom and reported that to his superiors. Nobody really paid much attention to this as far as press coverage was concerned. It was really only 2 newspapers that did. the New York Times and the Washington Post. And that young reporter who was in that arraignment of the 5 burglars was Bob Woodward. Woodward eventually started making some inquiries. He was partnered up with Carl Bernstein, who also had done some looking into this. And eventually the Washington Post management decided to let these two start digging around and see what was going on. Because what they were finding was that in the belongings of the burglars, including the man who had said that he was with the CIA, his name was James McCord, they had found references to individuals who had connections with the White House. And because this was a burglary and in a political office, the question became, okay, who were these men and who was supporting them to do this? Was this actually a burglary, or was this some sort of political espionage going on? By the way, if you didn't know, what's interesting is that the burglars, even though they were going in to put in the understanding is that they were going in to put bugs in the offices and on the phones of the Democratic workers. What they were actually doing was going in to replace the bugs that were already in the office, because some of them had stopped working. As they continued investigating, what they found was there was actually a huge network created specifically to do political espionage. That is to really handicap the Democrats and their presidential campaign. The Republicans wanted a specific candidate. They wanted George McGovern as the opponent to Nixon because they felt he was the weakest opponent. They were doing things like just dirty tricks to any sort of political meeting with the Democrats all around the country. They were just they were doing things like ordering 500 pizzas for a conference that might be going on, a Democratic conference that might be going on when the pizza arrived, nobody knew what was happening at the conference. They were just doing things that to some extent were just tricks, were just nuisances, but others were actually working to push the election in Richard Nixon's direction. And also what they found was that there were millions of dollars stashed away in what was called a slush fund at the Committee to Re-elect the President's offices. The acronym CREEP was created for the Committee to Re-elect the President. And was kind of disparagingly referred whenever there was some reference to the Committee to Re-elect, and to a certain extent was well fitted. Eventually, their investigating gets to a point where they start getting more and more evidence of those who are involved in all of these dirty tricks, to the extent that what they can do is reveal to the American people that some of the top officials in the White House and in the Nixon administration were working with this political espionage group and using ill-gotten money to do it while they were in office in appointed offices and working with the president. One of them was John Ehrlichman, who was a longtime friend of the president. He had been appointed to Nixon's, not necessarily his cabinet, but as an advisor on domestic affairs. He had the president's ear. They talked daily about things. And even more importantly was Bob Haldeman. Bob Haldeman was, again, a longtime associate of Richard Nixon, but more importantly, he was Nixon's chief of staff. If the president of the United States is the most important person in the country, the chief of staff is the second most important person in the country, because it's the chief of staff who really is the person behind the president. It's the chief of staff who makes sure that things get done, who makes sure the president is meeting the right people, that legislation is being properly pushed through the Congress. The chief of staff is really the one who gets things done in the White House. And what the Washington Post and the New York Times reporting was finding was that these two were, if not directly involved in the dirty tricks themselves, they were either the ones who they were at least supporting those dirty tricks, and in some cases were initiating these kinds of tricks from the White House, which is a violation of law. So the question became that if the two top senior advisors to the President of the United States knows that this sort of scandal is going on, therefore, how much does the President know, and when did he know it? This was the question that everybody who now starts to do their own investigations, all the media who are starting to do their investigations into this, this is the question that everyone wants answered. Eventually, television gets involved in the investigations. In May of 1973, the Senate decides that it is going to, a democratically controlled Senate, starts its own hearings on the Watergate scandal. What's been going on? Why haven't, we need to have these people come and talk to us, and so we can gather evidence to see if any kind of laws have been broken, and if they've been broken, what should we as the Senate do about this? The network that covers these Senate hearings, because the Senate hearings are in the middle of the day, is public television. The networks don't really want to cover them because they're not sure what these are going to be about. They really don't think that anybody's going to be interested in them. And daytime television is an important revenue generator for network television. So it's public television, public PBS, that covers these gavel to gavel, these Senate hearings. And eventually, a lot of drama is generated during these hearings, and the major networks start covering them in daytime hours as well. And it's a significant change in thought, because the American people are tuning in. They're paying attention to this, and they want to know what's happening with their government. And it is television, again, that can take them there and show them what's going on. Polls indicate at the time that 85% of Americans are at least tuning in and know what's going on, and some are paying even more attention. I sat and watched these things when I was home. I was working nights at the time. I did because I thought they were fascinating. Probably the most important testimony given at the hearings was that of John Dean. John Dean was the counsel to the president. In other words, he was the lawyer for the office of the president. He is the one that the president, as a as an office holder, would go to and say, is it okay for the president to do something? Is it legal for the president to do something? And the president's counsel would then advise, and we would go from there. Well, what John Dean did in March of 1973 was he had a meeting with Nixon, and it was at this meeting, I think the date was March 21st, that he told Nixon that what he called was a cancer on the presidency. What he was trying to convey to Nixon is that this crime has been committed by these 5 burglars, and there are people in the White House who know what they were doing there, and that these people in the White House are now trying to cover it up, which is obstruction of justice and against the law. Nixon argues that this is the first time he's hearing about any sort of obstruction of justice. Eventually, what happens is it is revealed that all conversations in the Oval Office are tape recorded. A system was put into the Oval Office by John Kennedy. It was a very rudimentary system. Didn't record all the time, but then Richard Nixon had the system upgraded so that it would be voice activated. And his intention here was to have historical record that he could go back to in order to write his memoirs, or for historical reference for a particular legislation or event, world event that might happen, and the reaction in the White House. Once the Senate found out about these tape recordings, they called in the man who was primarily responsible for them.
When we got to Butterfield only because on our chart, he sat outside of Haldeman's office. And so we called him not knowing anything.
I knew they would never get on the subject of tapes, never. But if they did, I was ready with if it's a fuzzy question, I'll give a fuzzy answer, oblique. If it's a direct question, I'll answer it directly.
But when he was asked a question, he thought we knew, because we had already questioned Haldeman. And he didn't know whether Haldeman told us the truth or not, so he didn't want to get caught in perjury.
There were so many people in there, and I was center of attention. And then finally, Senator Irwin said, "Committee come to order." That's just exactly the way he said it. "Committee will come to order." Tap, tap, tap. And the room quieted down.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
He says, well, I guess you know, but you're asking me about one tape. It wasn't one tape. I put in a taping system that recorded the president's conversations 24 hours a day since the spring of 1971. Boom.
And that boom meant that there was evidence of what the president knew and when he knew it. Because if he talked to any of his subordinates, any of his assistants about the Watergate burglary or a cover-up of the White House involvement before John Dean told him about the cancer on the presidency in March of 1973, that meant that the president was a part of that cover-up. And that would mean that's evidence in a possible impeachment and trial for the removal of Richard Nixon as president. What came from this was one of the more significant constitutional crises in American history. The White House had evidence of the president potentially committing a felony, and the United States Senate wanted those tapes to listen to them. The president, the White House at first said no, then they changed that to, okay, we're going to give you transcripts that are only of things related to Watergate, not anything else. The Senate said that wasn't enough. You need to give us the tapes. The president again said, I'm not giving you the tapes. I will give you all the I'll give you transcripts of all the tapes that I think are relevant to your investigation. The Senate said, no, that's not enough. We want all the tapes. We'll choose what we need to have. And therefore, you have two branches of government in conflict with each other. Congress eventually hires a special prosecutor. The Watergate burglars themselves, they also want to have access to these tapes because on there could be exculpatory evidence for them and their trials. So all of these entities are looking to have the White House turn over these tapes because they could be evidence in all sorts of situations. Eventually, with a constitutional crisis like this, the case is going to go to the Supreme Court. The Congress sues Richard Nixon to have him release the tapes. This is one of those cases that, because it is a constitutional crisis, goes immediately to the Supreme Court to decide. And by a 9-0 decision, the Supreme Court says that, yes, the president is not above the law and must release the tapes to the Congress and to all other entities that need them. Once the tapes are released, more investigations begin, and as the contents of the tape become known to the different committees, the houses, impeachment hearings begin in the Judiciary Committee in the House of Representatives in February of 1974. And then in August of 74, it is revealed that there is on one tape what's known as the smoking gun. On the July 21st, 1972 recording of Nixon speaking with his chief of staff and his advisors, he makes the comment about trying to get the CIA to talk to the FBI to slow down the investigation. And that basically says that the president knew about the cover-up and was a part of the cover-up well before the date that John Dean supposedly told Nixon about the cover-up for the first time in March of 1973. And this is the smoking gun that eventually leads to Richard Nixon resigning. Articles of impeachment are passed by the House Judiciary Committee in July of 1974. By August, the Republicans in the Senate and the House are going to Richard Nixon and saying that the articles of impeachment are going to be passed, and you really don't have a chance to win in the trial in the Senate that would be coming after the impeachment, and that he should resign the office. So the immediate effect of the Watergate investigation started by really two young reporters from the Washington Post and the New York Times culminates really in the President of the United States going on television on August 8th and announcing that he will resign his presidency to take effect at noon the next day.
August 8th, 1974.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Of course, Woodward and Bernstein eventually go on to write their chronicle of this investigation called All the President's Men, that is eventually turned into a movie. If you haven't seen the movie, it's well worth watching. But the book is even better because the movie only goes through the first half of the book. The rest of the book is about the final days of the president, and the investigation that continues into that. So those are the four historical events that really have had significant influence on journalism and really helped shape modern journalism into what it is today. Specifically the immediate effects that came just after or during, sometimes during those events. Now we're going to look at really kind of long-term effects that these events have had, both on the American culture and society, but also on the media. The long-term effect related to the Kennedy assassination is something we've already talked about, one of the long-term effects. And that is, again, over that weekend of November 22nd, the importance of television news changed. It became the primary source of news and information used by the American public. Previously, newspapers had been the primary source, but simply because of the immediacy of the coverage that was necessary during that traumatic event nationally, television became the source, and it became the permanent source, quite literally, of the American public for news and information. It also television became the medium through which the nation mourns a national tragedy. I mean, if you think about it, on that weekend, that was this is what the country watched. It was, they watched the procession up Pennsylvania Avenue, the service at the National Cathedral, the burial at the National Cemetery at Arlington, and if you think about it, when there has been a national tragedy, it's been television that has brought the country together, and really helped heal the wounds of the nation when something terrible has happened. It also changed the way the press covered the office of the presidency. It's quite appropriate to say it's kind of a death watch. The press was out of position. They didn't think that the trip to Dallas was all that noteworthy until the President of the United States was shot dead. And since that time, the press goes everywhere the President of the United States goes. There is a special section on Air Force One for the press. And there is another plane with the rest of the press that covers wherever the president is traveling. There is a special office space in the West Wing for the press to be wherever the president is. And this was really no greater evidence of this was can be seen then in the attempt by John Hinckley to shoot Ronald Reagan in March 30 of 1981. It wasn't an attempt. He actually shot Reagan, and Reagan's survival of that was in doubt for a while. But it was the press that was there and documented the whole thing, including the taking down of Hinckley and him being put into custody by the Secret Service. So the press has the long-term effects here really have been in the way that the president is covered and how we use national media in healing the wounds of the nation when there are tragic events. As far as civil rights, really what has happened with civil rights is the media have become the conduit through which protests are made. That is, that if a certain group wants to make its statements known, its protests of civil liberties being trampled on, they go to the press. If there is something that there is an injustice somewhere, people go to the press, go to the New York Times, tell the New York Times what's going on. This is because the civil rights movement was covered by the press and really helped initiate social change in the country with respect to races. The disabled Americans have gone to the press and demonstrated that they, when they want laws changed, even in the last couple of years, when there have been laws that were going to be repealed or let languish. Disabled people went to the halls of Congress to protest to their Congresspeople, and the press was there to cover it. The Me Too movement of today, the LGBTQ movement for gay marriage was covered by the press, and the press was used by the movement to get legislation passed, and eventually a Supreme Court ruling that said gay marriage was not illegal. So civil rights movement really kind of paved the way for using the media and the press to generate social change. The legacy of the Vietnam and Watergate events is really a movement towards keeping an eye on our government. That is, that the press really are the watchdogs. The press really have to keep an eye on what the government's doing. And this, again, if you remember way back when we talked about the John Peter Zenger trial, it is the responsibility of the press. It really has solidified the responsibility of the press to watch our government. And quite honestly, there has been no more important time than right now to watch our government and our president, and to make sure that the American people see what's going on in our government today. It also, with the problems with the Vietnam War and the problems initiated by an administration culminating in Watergate, the fact that that these things happen and they're brought out by the press really cultivates in us a level of distrust and watchfulness. That is, that we have to watch our government and who's in our government and what those people are doing in our government, and if need be, change the government. In 1974, after Nixon resigned, the elections of November of 74, there were 49 House seats that changed from Republican to Democrat. And what that did was really kind of solidify the Democrats as a power, legislative power, from 1974 really into to 1980, when Ronald Reagan and his coattails brought Republicans back into power. But this really is something, again, that is meaningful for today, that we as American citizens have to watch our government very, very closely nowadays, because there are discrepancies, there are violations of the law taking place in front of us. And if we don't know about these things and do something about it in November, we may have 4 more years that will lead us down a very, very dismal path. So those are the 4 events. The following PowerPoints will look at the changes in technology and how that has affected modern journalism, and then really the change in public access.